Recording. So, welcome to the evening of Python coding. Uh, we have today a guest, just like me. I'm broadcasting from Israel now. Adam is also from Israel these days, and today is actually interesting times. But let's not talk about the interesting time in Israel. Let's talk about something that Adam does. It's a web framework called Sonic, and Adam will tell you much better than I about it. So, Adam, floor is yours. Tell us about Sonic.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. So you said my name's Adam Hopkins. Here's just a quick little bit of information about myself, so you understand who I am, where I'm coming from. Um, I work for a company called Packet Fabric. We provide networking as a service, basically. So we connect data centers um, and you know to cloud products. Go check out our website, and there's a much better explanation for what than what I can provide here. But basically, we sort of have a software-based platform running on Sanic, actually. So where we're setting up in networks, layer 2, layer 3 networks. All right, so Sanic, what is Sanic? I work on this open source project. It started out in 2016. I think in the chat, Alex popped in the first commit. It started sort of as like an attempt to see if we could take Flask, the basics of Flask, and make it async awaitable. So this is sort of right in the wake of when async IO dropped into Python, and there was this sort of these new keywords, and everybody was not really sure what they did and how they worked and what you could do with them. So this was sort of an early attempt to kind of take what existed as the Flask API and make it async await. Since then, a lot of people might be aware, or there's other projects like Court that actually sticks very closely to the Flask API and tries to be a one-to-one. And there's dozens of other frameworks that are kind of running in the same sphere, that are all trying to be these async compatible Python frameworks. But Python, or sort of at the time, didn't really have anything else. So that's kind of where Sanic came from. And what kind of makes it a little bit different than a lot of the others is that it does not, or was not originally intended to run on ASGI. So for anyone that is familiar with Python web frameworks in general, usually you have to.
API
I'm
for
going to get there.
beginners,
I'm going to
please.
get there. I'm going to
Okay.
get there. I'm going to get there. So anyone that is ever run a Python web server, you need to run a server, and there's got to be some sort of mechanism for that server to talk to the framework. So historically, that has been over a protocol that's known as WSGI. And that's just sort of a general contract between the server and the framework about how information is going to get passed back and forth between the two. So some years go by, and say sometime, I think this was in maybe 2019 timeframe, maybe earlier. There was a gap where there was no standard way for async frameworks. They couldn't exist over WSGI, so there needed to be a new standard, and that's called ASGI. So that is basically just how async frameworks can talk to an async server. There's a couple of big names out there if you're familiar with them: UVcorn, Hypercorn, Daphne, which was sort of the first one, but Sanic originally predated all of that, so therefore it comes with its own server baked into it. You don't have to use the Sanic server. You can use one of the other ASGS servers if you want. But generally, you get the best performance if you use the one that it ships with, just because it's sort of tuned to running Sanic applications as much as possible. If anyone's interested, I can talk a little bit about how we do a lot of interesting things at startup time to try to optimize the runtime environment specifically to the application sitting in front of it. So if that's something that we want to get into, we can do that. I'm really kind of open to take this conversation in any direction that kind of makes sense for the group. So I'll start talking a little bit about how Sanic works, and then if we want to steer the conversation, please. Happy to take questions.
I'm gonna push you in a certain direction that I don't
Go
want
for it.
to. We always have some beginners who don't even understand what a web server does or nothing. So at least show something very, very, very simple and very basic, and then go on into more complicated things, please.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's take this very basic. So over here on the left, let's get rid of this code because we don't need this. Over here on the left, this is what a typical hello world example is going to look like. If we want, let's take one step further and actually put in some there we go. So okay, so you set up an application. You have a handler. This handler is going to have a definition to some path, and then you're going to run some sort of function. So this is sort of the standard Flask style of web development that has become very popular in Python. So I said that Sanic originally started trying to prove the concept of whether or not we could make the Flask API async await, and it sort of existed as a hobby for a couple of years, and starting in maybe 2017 timeframe, 2018. The original maintainers were kind of wavering and kind of lost their interest. That's where I came in with a group of other people who we wanted to take the project and kind of run forward with it. So at that point, we had contacted the original maintainer, and some weeks went by, and we were going to just fork the whole project and start over. And when one day he responded to us and said, "Here, take the project and run with it." And at that point, we turned it into this community organization and tried to sort of make the whole thing stable and production worthy. And that's sort of one of the things that we really try to push for, is making sure that the development experience matches the production experience as much as possible. And we can talk a little bit about that if anyone's interested about what that actually means. But let's take a little real quick back at what's going on here. Okay, so we've got our app instance. You have to give it a name. And there are some restrictions here, what kind of names we accept. So the names need to sort of basically follow the same patterns that you would for a variable name in Python. So it's got to be letters and numbers, no spaces, no special characters. And the reason why we do that is that every single route inside of the application ends up having a path to it. And part of that path to it includes this name. So this request down here itself, there ends up being a route object that will be called, it'll be called example.test. So this, as a string, is going to reference this specific route. And that sort of becomes important if you're starting to do any introspection which, again, we'll get to that if we need to. Okay, so how are you going to run this? So Sanic comes with a CLI. You don't have to use a CLI. You can instantiate everything inside directly from Python, run it as a script. Generally, we tell people to use the CLI just because you're less likely to shoot yourself in the foot. But for those that want to, be a little more adventurous, go for it. So basically, what you can do is you give it a path to your app instance. That's one option. Another thing you could do is you could give it a path to a directory, and it'll serve that as a directory. I'll show what that looks like in a minute. But what we're going to do is we're just basically going to follow this pattern here. Okay. So Sanic, and we've got the name of this file here. You might not be able to see the name of it. Is helloworld.py. So I'm just going to say hello world, and we've got an instance called app. So I'm going to put app down here. Then I'll run that. All right. So what we can see up here is we can see a little bit of information about what's going on with it. Right now, we're actually in production mode, and that's going to be the default. So what I'm actually going to do is I will drop out of that and put that into development mode. And the reason why is when you're in development mode, you get a little bit more debug information out in the logs. You get access to a couple more utilities. And the other thing that's also really important is you get reloader. Okay, so here we go. Now we're in debugging mode. You can see we're running a Sanic server. I can see my Python version. I can see some packages that I have installed. And now here are my logs. So in order for me to get to this, right, I'm just going to use curl. Curl localhost, and you can see here's my response right here. By default, Sanic will go ahead and all the stuff that you sort of would expect. It's going to give you your status codes. It's going to add headers that you need to, and of course anything that you need to modify inside of this object. If you want to, here you go. Want to add some headers? You want to change your status to something else? You can do that. And now I've got new headers, and I got my new status code.
Can you show how it can be accessed for a browser? Like whatever app is running, can you show how it interacts with the browser?
Sure.
Because some of the beginners have to understand that whatever you wrote here is basically a web server. Like it's like a website page basically.
It is 100%. So this is what we did, right? So here's our base address here, and you can see we don't have a very basic response. But let's change it. Okay, let's change it up, right? So let's make this an HTML. So we're going to serve HTML hello world. All right, and we'll take a look, and now you can see. Okay, so that's all fairly simple stuff, right? One of the other things too that if you're familiar with something else that's very common is, let's say we need to have let's say we have some sort of parameters inside our routes. Those will automatically get injected here. And we can put that here. Okay, so now I'm going to go to some URL. Let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Okay, So now what we should expect is that we'll get this back in our response. And sure enough, we do. One thing to note is that these path parameters, and again, anyone that's done any sort of web frameworks will probably be used to this, but we can set this as different types. Depending on what types we give them, we'll change what kind of values we get. So let's say we know that we want this to be an integer. Okay, I'm just going to change that to an integer. And now, actually, let's go to the same thing. So we go to this exact same thing. So slash something, and you can see we're now getting a 4, and the reason why is because Sand is expecting only routes that are going to have an integer here.
4 for the beginners means an error, correct?
Correct. That means we've got this here. Nothing's found. So let's take another look.
Desiree has a question.
Go for it.
Hey, so if you're working on your own project, are you always going to call localhost 8000?
That's a really good question. So I'm using that just because it's the simplest right now. When I'm working on a project that I actually intend to launch, so it's something that I doing at work or one of my own personal projects, I usually will not use localhost just because I try to mimic whatever environment that I know that I'm ultimately going to deploy to, and that decision ultimately depends upon what your requirements might be. It is. So let me unpack that a little bit, what I mean. So let's say I plan on building a website and having some front end framework, handle all my JavaScript and all my UI. One of the things that it's probably going to want to do is send requests back to my web server, and if those are going to be running on different servers, one of the things you see a lot is CORS issues. CORS, CORS. That is a security measure that's sort of built into browsers to impact, to sort of mitigate that the front end of a website is actually speaking properly to the back end and isn't being hijacked. So in that case, I generally try not to use localhost because it sort of some browsers kind of use localhost a little bit differently than they might some other web address. So I might try to change that to atom.local or something like that. And I have atom.local set up on my machine to always point to my local machine. But that local host can really be whatever. Since on my machine I have it set up to 127.0.0.1, that's what I'm using right now.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yep. I guess actually that is actually sort of brings up another interesting point too, that because Sanic does sort of this, and I'll show you actually. Let's go back to here. One of the things that it has is this other flag called auto TLS. So if I run this, what it's actually doing before it does anything else is it's generating a set of certificates here, and it's now exposing it as an HTTPS site. So now if I try to hit it down here, right? So I try to go to, let's be a little more explicit here, HTTP 127.0.0.1. This is where I was trying to get to before. It doesn't work because now it's being exposed as HTTPS, and it's also it's on this port now. So just an interesting little feature, if anyone that specifically I find really useful what did I do wrong here? I'm not sure what I did. It is, but it's sort of a really helpful, especially when you're dealing with front end development and you need to be able to talk to an HTTPS server. But let's get rid of that for now because we don't need it. Okay. So what I wanted to show here, getting back to this example, is that we can here we go. Is that by changing the type here, we can impact the response type as well. So previously it was returning a string, now it's returning an integer because we said that it wants an integer. You can't just put any type here. Well, I guess you can. There are specific types that it knows about. If you try to use a type that it doesn't know about, you just sort of need to give it a nudge and say and let it know. But that you can always look up in the documentation to see exactly how I want to do that. There are specific things that are sort of built in, right? So very common things you might want to do is have a UUID, or you might want to have a date object, right? So maybe you're on a blog website, building a blog, and you want to have a have a year, month, date parameter in your your path. Yeah, some common things.
Can you handle any objects or?
You can. Actually, there's this really interesting pattern, and actually maybe what I'll do here. Let's bring up the documentation here. Okay, let's jump down to. So this is here we go. Here's the example that I was going to show. Okay. Here, let's just copy this and it'll all right. So here we go. I've got a data class here. Okay. Ice cream, and it's got some kind of a flavor. Okay, so let's do this over. So here. Now we can see it. Okay. So I'm being explicit here in calling it and saying it's a string, but we actually don't need this. Let's get rid of that to keep it simple. So because what's going on here is I'm telling it that there is this new type that it needs to be aware of called ice cream. What it will do is when a request comes in, it's going to try to take this parameter and inject it into this object and build this object and put it in here. So here, let's do this. Localhost, let's call it vanilla. And see what did I mess up here? Oh. Here we go. So you can see this here is coming from my string definition here, where I've got where when it gets converted to a string, this is the value that it outputs. But you can say this is actually the type of object that I get here. So we'll go print this out. My flavor. And you can see up in my logs now, I've got it up here. Here we go. So you can any object you want. You just might need to dive in a little bit to tell it how to create that object. One of the things that actually I do quite often, um, let's say, and this might be a little bit of a different pattern, but let's say I know that part of my address, my URL here is going to be like an IP address or something like that. In that case, you can go ahead and define a custom type. And instead of having an object here, you could give it like a function, and it'll run that function. Let's not go down that route right now, because that gets to be a little bit more complex. Okay, so let's jump over to, let's see, this one here. So another pretty common pattern is to create these classes, and rather than creating a decorator for every single route, you might want to create a class of grouped objects. This is often what you might do if you're building out like a RESTful framework. And generally what that means is you're attaching these HTTP verbs. So these are different types of HTTP requests. There's standard verbs that go along with all these. I'll show you what that looks like in a minute, but since they're all going to be related working on some sort of related object, related domain, some information, we can group them together into one class like this. And so if we're going to run this, let's get this. And this is, let's see, simple async view app. Okay. So now we've got, here is where we're attaching that route to our application instance. So let's go localhost, and we'll say 8,000. And out of the box, it's going to do a GET request. So right now I'm hitting this method right here. Using curl, right? You can change that. This is the way you would do it, to change it to one of these other versions, and then this will get me into post or patch, all the other types of methods. This is generally very helpful. Also, when you're dealing with, say you're dealing with, cores like I talked about, and you need to have an options handler, which is, let's not even go down that route.
Desiree, you can jump in. You don't need to raise your hand. It's okay.
Since these defs are so similar, and they're all under the same class, is there a way that's in good practice to create a shorter version to run through all of them?
Yeah, you could. Sure, absolutely. You could, if we wanted to refactor all this, sure, you could. Let's say, method and you could do something like this for all of them. So that's sort of one of the advantages of this pattern, is because you're just dealing with Python objects. Build it however you want. One of the things that Sanic tries very hard to do. And right, I'll even let's go right at the beginning here. One of the things that it really tries to do is this right here. It tries to stay very unopinionated and tries to get out of your way as much as possible. So Python is, really lucky in my opinion that it's got a lot of different types of frameworks, and they all do different things, and they all work slightly differently and are really good in different use cases, in different patterns. So one thing that Sanic is sort of the opposite of what Django does, right? So people that develop in Django, there's a sort of set pattern and set approach that a lot of applications take. And one of its benefits is that it kind of comes out of the box with a whole lot of set of utilities, and you've got a particular way that you need to access your database. You're going to be handling and validating all of your data that's coming in it. Sanic tries to get out of the way and not do any of that, and instead just give you a set of tools and let you build your application how you want. And sort of the, one of the side, one of the ways that we see that is that you're just building objects however you want to, and functions however you need to. So generally what I see is these methods here are going to generally be fairly short. You're going to have maybe 10 lines of code in there. And what they will do is they'll point to code in other functions and other classes, and take all that business logic to some other location so that it can be reused over and over and over again. So 100%.
Thanks.
Okay, so on that same exact point, a common pattern is to group logic together into these objects called blueprints. And a blueprint is just a collection of routes. So you can see we have one blueprint object here. And instead of having app.route, we have blueprint.route, blueprint 2, blueprint 3, etc. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to put sort of a common part of the web URL, and group them together. So I don't need to specify all of the entire full URL. So let's take a look at what this one's going to look like. So Sanic, let's see, blueprints app, and get onto the dev server. Okay. So here, if I just do /foo, right, I'm going to get my page not found. I'm going to get this error message because there's nothing that is just at foo. I have to have one of these parts of my URL here. Here we go. And that's, now I've reached this one. Now what this is also really helpful is what we could do, is we can actually take all these objects and let's say we want to group them together. Okay, so let's make a group of, saying group, and now these three blueprints are all together in this one object. And now what I need to do is attach them. So app.blueprint group. And so the same sort of thing that I can do is I can add a URL prefix to these. So now, sorry about that. Okay, so now all of these URLs will now have this at the beginning of it. So what this is really handy for and what really helpful for is a very common practice when you're creating an API is to put it on version, to create versions. So let's say I've got version, let's just call it, do it like this for now. And what this will do under the hood is it'll change my URL to let's see. Oh, forgot to get rid of this. So it'll take this version 3 and it'll translate it to a v3 inside of my path parameter here. So this is a pretty common practice. So a lot of what you'll see is you'll create these blueprint objects in in a bunch of different files. You can import them all over the place, and it sort of is a very good way to encapsulate your logic and keep different types of your application located in different files, and then bring them all together in one location and version them as you need to. All right, let's keep going a little bit. So at the beginning, I showed you this, right?
Can you come in back to the version thing? I missed something there.
Sure.
I apologize.
No problem.
So the version changes which object you have, like different blueprint 1 is version 1, blueprint 2 is version 2, and so on and so forth. And basically you just change the version you're working with. It's like you have a website and then you have a new version of the website, then you just redirect to it.
So what you see this with often is, let's say I'm building out an API that I know is going to get used. So I might launch version 1 of that API. And at some point, I've got customers, they're going to start interacting with it. They're going to build their own integrations on top of my application. And you may want to introduce new versions so that you can change your API, so that you can have breaking changes and you can leave your existing customers who still integrate. So this is something that we do often where I work. We have a lot of customers who will create direct integrations to our backend without going through our web portal, and so that we are able to continue to innovate and serve our customers without breaking anything. We might give them version 1, then we might go and build something on version 2, 3, 4, etc. And it's just sort of a way to very easily group logic without breaking someone's existing application.
So your customer still sees the old URL they are using, but
Correct.
You somehow know to serve them version 1, correct?
Correct. So what I might have is I might just have, I might have another copy of this who's gonna point to, this is gonna maybe point to different objects. So let's say, I've got blueprint 2 here, and this one's gonna have blueprint 3 in it. All right, so maybe I've got some sort of setup like this. This is the idea here, is that we're just taking these objects and making them as composable as possible. So a blueprint is just a grouping of routes, and then we can take those routes and we can further shove them into another hierarchy.
Okay, but how does the new customer know that he's talking to a new version, which he has a different URL than the old customer?
Yeah, right. So I'll end up, in this case, I'll end up with 2 different versions of that URL. One will be version 2, one will be version 3. One of the things that Sanic does provide, and we could take a look at what this is here, is out of the box. It comes with open API specifications. This is, let's take a real quick look at it. So open API is a specification for how to describe web APIs with, here's you see the path, here's the parameters. You can give them descriptions, tell exactly what that endpoint expects, what kind of, I can see here's version 2. I should have, well, I didn't attach version 3, but you basically would describe your whole how to interact with your API. And so a customer would come into something like this and they would see, they would learn how they can interact with you. So this is typically how things like this get published.
Thank you.
All right, another cool thing that I really like. So let's jump over to a different directory. Okay. So here I'm going to Here I'm going to I'm using the Sanic CLI, and instead of giving it the name of some web application, I'm giving it to some directory that exists. So right now I'm just going to give it this directory here. And what this is going to do is it's going to set up a web server, at this location, and it's going to serve this directory. So now let's pop over to my browser here. And so you might see something like this with Nginx does this. A lot of other servers do this, where they sort of out of the box come with this directory, and you can see what I've got here. We've got some PNGs. Here's all the files, and that one's really small. The other actually really interesting thing, this is actually, so under the hood, right? Sanic is creating a web server, and on that web server, it's generating all the HTML here that you see. One of the things that is really helpful, let's jump back to a regular app here. Let's see. Okay, let's really quickly create an app here. From Sanic, import Sanic. Okay. And we want actually, let's not even do that. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm intentionally inducing an exception, right? So if Python's going to evaluate 1 divided by 0, I should get an exception here. So let's so out of the box, what Sanic is going to do is it's going to give me this nice little error page where it shows me exactly where this code is, tells me what the error that I've got. It's going to give me some information about that request that it came from, and so all this stuff will be really helpful for me to debug. Now let's take this one step further, and let's abstract some of this, right? So let's call cause error. We're gonna call this function. All right, so we're just gonna push it down a function here. Now what happens is I got these tabs here. So I can navigate through these tabs, and I can navigate through the entire call stack and see exactly where that error is being bubbled up from. And it gives me this nice little syntax highlighting, which shows me which line of code is causing this. This I think is super helpful and a really nice feature that we added last year sometime.
This is only in debug, correct? If you want to put it on a production server, you don't want to, someone seeing your code.
Absolutely. So what you'll see then, let's get rid of debug. And when you're in production mode, you're going to just see something like this. Now this is obviously also brings up another good point too. Is you might not want this, right? You might not ever want this to be your default, and you might want to have your own exceptions and your own pages, or some other completely different type of logic that happens when there's going to be an error. So this is only happening right now because we did not tell Sanic what to do if there's a problem. But there's a full API specifically on how to handle this issue and tell it what should do. So here we go. Let's go take a look and see what that might look like. We're going to create an app exception handler. I love that I now have all this. I don't even have to type anything anymore. Copilot does everything for me, except sort of. There we go. Okay. So what we have here is, it looks very similar, obviously, to a route handler, but instead we're saying whenever you come across zero division error, call this function instead. Let's give this a status. Let's call it a status, 500, that's fine. So now we're going to run this. Let's come back to the browser here. And instead of getting this page, we get our custom error page. And just to prove that we're getting that, let's do it with curl. And you can see we are indeed getting our internal server error, status 500. So that's coming from here. We can go one step further than this. So there is a custom exception type called Sanic exception. And so I use this pattern quite often. Let's say we know in our application we're going to have here we go. We know we're going to have this kind of some custom logic that at some point is going to raise this exception. We can define specific information that is pertinent to that response. So now if we just raise this, you can see I've got I've got my 41418. I'm a teapot error, and this is coming from this status code right here. We can customize this even further, and I can give it a specific message. And this again, sort of, here's my message here. And this is one of those, again, going back to that earlier conversation about providing a set of tools and allowing you to abstract your logic and put it somewhere else. Like, we take as much information out of these handlers as we can and put it elsewhere so that we can make it reusable over and over again. Any questions about stuff I've talked about so far? Anything else you want me to kind of talk about?
Well, let's ask the audience. You're way over my head already. It's like, no, I actually have a question. So, like, while others thinking of what they want you to show them, I like Flask also started something very, very small, but then there were extensions. People started building all sorts of extensions, like forms, ways to do it. Well, Django was like, everything was fully integrated, and all the forms and database were inside and stuff like that. What's with Sonic? So is it going in that direction? Does it have like plugins that will enhance it or something like this? Okay, tell us a little bit about those.
Yes. So it follows the Flask pattern a little bit more closely. I mean, Django also has hundreds of plugins as well. I think any sort of popular framework will have those. Sonic does have a set of plugins. There are some that we, the core maintainers of the project, maintain ourselves, but there's a number of them outside maintainers also do. So, typical stuff like authentication is a popular one. There's also, so out of the box, that whole thing that I showed earlier with the open API specifications, where it was auto-generating all that API documentation, that itself does not ship with Sonic out of the box. That comes from an external extension, one that the core team maintains, but that's an extension. We try to keep what's inside of Sonic itself to be fairly limited, primarily so that we're not shipping with a lot of additional packages that wouldn't be necessary, so that applications can be lean and lightweight and don't have a whole lot of bloat to them unless they need it. But there is I'm sure you've seen a lot of these things before. These awesome pages, which is just a link, which is just a GitHub repository with links to a whole bunch of other stuff. We can drop that in the chat too. So you can see here's a whole bunch of stuff. If you need to interact with the database, there's some ORMs, authentication is obviously a big one. This one here, actually, this first project up here, this is how actually I got into to begin with. So I had mentioned sort of at the time, it was really kind of a proof of concept. This is in 2016, right? There were very few plugins at all. And so I created this plugin here that would set up a set of authentication endpoints and generate these web tokens so that you can add authentication to a Sonic application, because it didn't exist. There was no other way to do it. and I was using it on some projects, and that's kind of when, when I realized that there was sort of a need to take over the main project itself. So, but my first jump into open source contribution was actually creating this here. Which, by the way, I could probably give an entire talk just on that. If anyone out there is looking for ideas on how to boost your career opportunities, or just to make yourself a better developer, 100%. I can't stress it enough. I think the best thing you can do for yourself is to get involved in an open source project of anyone. Doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't have to be something as big and ambitious as Sanic. It could be something small, or it can be, whatever you find interesting. I highly suggest you approach contributors. Just say, hey, how can I help out? I'm sure someone would, just about anywhere, any project would love to have help, because it's in my opinion, and I'm speaking now, I guess, as a hiring manager. I love to see people that are working in open source, because number one, I can go and actually see their work product. I can just go into GitHub and I can see what they've done. But I also know a little bit, about what types of environments they've worked in. Working in open source, you get to meet people from all over the world. You get to learn how different types of people work, what their development practices might look like. So just a little sidebar. I'm a big proponent. Get yourself involved.
Actually, if you're bringing this up, we always have beginners coming here and looking for the way to get in. So do you recommend some, you already recommend involving in open source project. Does Sonic has some open issues that you are recommended for beginners, absolute beginners?
Yep, we do. So we do, a lot of projects will do this too, right? This isn't unique to Sanic, but we do create labels of issues that we know are going to be a little bit simpler to fix. So if anyone is wants to, pick one of these up, they can come and generally what will happen, myself or one of the other people on the team will, someone says, hey, can I take this? Can I take this? We'll say, absolutely. Here's how you can do it. We'll help you figure out how to solve the issue. I'll help you figure out how to create a pull request if you've never done that before. There's always a need, even if there aren't these nice little helpful labels. I would say most projects out there would love to have someone new, even if, in my opinion, I don't really care what the experience level is, because everybody has something that can contribute. Even if it's simple, one of the things, I've been showing, going through, and I don't know actually how well you can see it, but let's take a look at the code here. So all the examples that I was going through exist in this examples directory inside of the project. So these files here, you could see they don't get touched all that often. It's sort of one of those areas of the repository that kind of gets set it and forget it, and some time might go by. So one of the things that's super helpful is just having somebody every once in a while just go in and run some of these things, and if something is broken, pop in and say, hey, this doesn't work anymore, or come up with a new example of how to do something else simple and create a little create, add a new file here. Like even stuff like that is hugely beneficial.
Thank you. Anyone has more questions?
Quick question, Adam. So, is there like a gallery or maybe place where you can find websites or apps that's built on Sanic?
That's a really good question. So I think that awesome Sanic page might have a handful of them. Because Sanic is a backend, it's a little bit hard to get that, right? It's hard to know exactly where it's being used unless somebody's going to publish it and tell us about it. We have a Discord server where people pop in, and on Discord we'll talk about what they're building and tell us a little bit about it. But generally, it's a little bit difficult to get that information. There are a number of projects that do use it. I know a number of companies that use it. I can't necessarily publish that information just because I don't have permission to. But there are a bunch. I know actually one that that you see that there is the Italian government actually uses it for a couple of things, and I know that just because I see their GitHub page linked to ours. Yeah, it's a really good question. I really wish there was a better answer. Unfortunately, it's you're entirely at the liberty of some company saying, "Hey, you can use my logo." And to be honest, we don't actually go out there and try to solicit that information from people. Like I'm not really, we're not necessarily trying to create that, and maybe that is a fault of ours, in the marketing aspect. But I'm a developer. I'm not in marketing.
Thanks, Adam. I think I found something like on GitHub. If you just search Sanic and then look at the first page results, there are some people in the Git repo description. They say it's like my blog using Sanic or
Yeah, there's also
based on Sanic.
where is it? This here. Here you go. You can get to this page here, and you can see there's a whole bunch of repositories that are using Sanic. A lot of the stuff will just be individual people. And then again, some company that's running it, obviously that isn't going to show up here. They're not going to advertise that to the world. You won't see their repository. So if you have a better idea of how we could capture that information, I would love to hear it. But
I have a somewhat I'm going to go back to the previous topic. If I want to get started with Sanic, like, okay, I watch the video now and I want to start. What's the easiest way to start? I have like a project in mind.
it's thing to start. So you mean to start using it to build something, or you start using or start contributing?
I have some AI I want to deploy it on the web. So I want to do it and I want to use Sanic. Example, or I have a form that I want to fill in to write my recipes and I want everyone to see. How do I do it on, like, what's the easiest way to start to actually learning? Like what resources do you recommend?
So okay, so number one is our website, sanic.dev. This is sort of the go-to location for information. We do have a lot of information here on like different types of use cases, different patterns that you might drill into different features. So all the information that I covered, right? Obviously, there's documentation for all this stuff. Here's all the information about blueprints and how you might group them together, etc. So definitely, this is number one resource for everything. The other thing that I would suggest is joining our Discord. There's a link up here. Here's a link to our Discord up here. This is a fairly active community where people come and they talk about different ideas and they say, hey, I've got this problem. Other people will come in and say, here's some solutions. So definitely getting involved, getting your voice heard. That's really important. For exactly how to build something and use cases, you can go and search and use pretty much any kind of pattern that you'd want. Because Sanic tries to get out of the way and not dictate what those patterns look like. Go look to see how you might build a Flask application, and it's gonna be the same. You have a lot of flexibility there.
But are there like examples that I can follow, like an easy place so I can actually find what people done,
Sure.
so I can.
Sure, and I guess this is where I'm going to do my own little shameless little plug. So I apologize.
Please do.
So, all right. So I wrote this book here. Right, Python web development with Sanic, pretty self-explanatory exactly what it is. But this website that we're on right now, this is chapter 14 of that book. Like the last chapter, actually I don't remember what the number is. Whatever the last chapter of the book is, it's how to build a web application from start to finish. And we build this. And one of the things you can do is you can go in and I tell people all the time, even people that don't haven't bought the book, like come here and take a look at the source code and figure out exactly how you can set up an application. Here we've got some blueprints. Here's a good example of that grouping pattern that I showed you, right? So we're importing all these different blueprints from different locations. We're sticking them inside of a group here. And then at some other point, we're going to import these objects and we're going to attach them to our application. So, so this is, again, this is my preference. This is how I like to build web apps. But I all the time I send people to here to take a look because I think this is really interesting from a couple of perspectives. Number one, you can look at all the code, right? But number two, you can go and actually interact with it as a web application. One of the things it does, so here, I'm going to log in, and this is that what I just showed you there is meant to be how you could integrate with like log in via GitHub or something like that. And now we've got a very simple little web app here, where you've got some books here that I'm reading, and you keep track of them. And if I want to add a new book, I can do that, etc. And all this stuff, there's an API underneath it. And going back to what we showed earlier, here's now an API, and you can see all these different endpoints. And now we can go and interact with them. So let's say let's go to here. So we should be able to sanicbook.com/ let's say this API/books. So I want to go to this. Here we go. Let's make this easier to read. And here's my response. So this is kind of a really cool pattern, in my opinion. One of the things that I wanted to do in the book was, besides just kind of talk through how to go about building a web application, number one, and number two, how to build a web application using Sanic. Number three is showing the real world example of how do you create an application that needs to connect to a database, that needs to connect to a caching server, and needs to have a front end, all these different things that are fairly complex to bring together, how to actually do that in the real world, and now go and interact with it, push and play and see what it actually looks like, run it yourself, and experiment. That's the way to learn, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay, good. So there are resources for people to learn. This is what I wanted to highlight. And there are probably examples that come with Sonic, correct?
Of course. Yep.
Okay, good. So there are resources, so people can use it. They know that others are using it. We saw so many, and there are ways to learn. And even if you want to contribute, there are some issues that you can help Sonic with. Correct?
100%.
Perfect. So hopefully it covers some of our audience, because I know they keep on asking the same questions again and again and again. But let's see if they have any more questions. Anyone? Questions going once? Questions going twice? Anyone more questions? Adam, you want to show us something else, or should we adjourn here?
I do actually want to touch on one other thing.
Okay.
So this is actually what I want to just jump into. This is, I guess, a little bit more advanced topic, but one of the things that I think is probably one of the best things that we added to Sanic in the last couple of years. So one of the things that Sanic works, and that this is not unique to Sanic. A lot of applications do this. So let's clear this all out, and let's say we're going to run this Hello World app. Okay. Now, I might want to have, say, a bunch of different workers. Let's say I'm going to have 3 different workers. So what this is going to do is set up 3 different processes that are now going to be responding to traffic. So you can see I've got here. I've got one here, and then I've got 2 others here. So these are distinct processes running on my machine. So this is going to be able to obviously increase the number of requests that I can return at a time. One of the things that we added was exposing that API to not just running Sanic applications, but basically running anything. So if you're familiar with Supervisor, it's a common package for running other utilities and kind of monitoring them and setting up. It's something that you can kind of do inside of Sanic now, which I think is hugely beneficial. So let me just quickly jump over to what this looks like. Okay, so real quick, when Sanic runs, we've got one process up here, and this is going to be kind of monitoring everything, the whole application. That main process is going to branch out into separate other processes. Some of them might be servers, one of them might be the reload server, etc. But what you can also do now is jumping down here, is you can create your own process. So what you do is we've got this thing called App Manager. This is what the API looks like. You give it a name, you give it a function, and that function is just going to be something that's going to get run in its own process all by itself, and Sanic is going to kind of monitor that. It'll start it, it'll stop it, It'll bubble up if there's errors, etc. So this pattern, obviously this is a really simple application here, but this pattern you could extend it to, say, you're running a web server, but you also want to run a chatbot server, right? So maybe you're building a Discord bot, so you need to have another process that needs to interact with your Discord server, or what I use it for a lot is I want to run another process in the background that'll handle expensive tasks. So I've got something that's gonna, that might take 10 seconds to complete. I don't want that to waste my web resources. So what I'll do is I'll push that off to a background process. And now, instead of running it on Celery or some other kind of server, I could kind of keep it all contained to my one application. So this to me opens up so many possibilities. And if anyone is building a production ready Sanic instance, and by production ready I mean something besides just what you might build for yourself, some kind of utility you might build for yourself, but if you're building something that is of any kind of scale, you're almost always going to come up with some use case where you need to run some kind of application somewhere else, and this is a really great way to do that.
Yeah, I already have ideas. This is actually something very interesting and timely.
Awesome.
Has anyone more questions? Questions going once? Question going twice? And yes, I see that people want to just clap. So no more questions. We're gonna make some noise, clap, make some emojis. Thank you, Adam.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. Guys, I'm gonna stop the recording. Don't go away. We're not going away, but thank you, Adam.